Hi everyone, Stepan here. In today's video I'm going to continue the series on the Grünfeld Defense, and today we are going to be looking at the Brinckmann Attack, which it's not considered to be an anti-Grunfeld per se, I think, but it sort of goes against Black's plans in the Grunfeld and tries to avoid the main lines, tries to avoid the open center, imbalanced aggressive games, and sort of is White asking for a calmer game than what a normal Grunfeld should be. So after d4, knight f6, c4, g6, knight c3, d5, the Grunfeld defense, White now plays the move bishop to f4. Bishop f4 is the Brinckmann attack. So instead of going for the exchange variation with c takes d5, instead of queen b3, which is the Russian, which we are going to cover, White chooses a slightly uncommon continuation, much rarer than the main lines and quite different to the main lines. If you haven't seen the introduction to the Grunfeld defense, I have made an introductory video. You can find it on the channel. I would advise you to look at it to make sure you understand the basic ideas behind the opening. Because the Brinckmann attack is quite different to the normal Grunfelds. So the reason why White plays bishop f4 here is because of simple development. White doesn't want to expand in the center with e4, which happens after d5 and the exchange variation, for example, takes, e4, knight takes, b takes. You can see that White has now advanced his e pawn to e4, and now his c1 bishop still has an open diagonal to develop to. In the Brinckmann attack after bishop f4, the move bishop f4 signifies that White wants to close the position down with the move e3 and play sort of a more normal, calmer queen's pawn opening, not the Grunfeld defense open center chaotic play. Okay, and Black has several ways to respond to the Brinckmann attack. One move which Black has to play before going on any farther is the move bishop g7. And this is the response you are always going to play to bishop f4 and to most other Grunfeld variations White can choose. So bishop g7 is your move. And now White has one more logical move he has to play, e3. So White has developed his bishop to f4 and opened the position up for his light squared bishop on f1. His next few moves, if Black does nothing, are going to be either bishop d3 or bishop e2, either knight f3 or knight e2, and castling. And White is going to have a safe position. Now, the Brinckmann attack can transpose to a lot of different openings. This can occur from the semi-Slav and Slav positions if the game now continues e6, c6, and for some reason Black chooses to play g6, bishop g7. This can be several different openings, and it can still transpose to the reti, it can still transpose to the sort of what Black does against the King's Indian attack in some variations. After c5, it can resemble some lines in the Tarrasch and the semi-Tarrasch. So this, the Brinckmann attack, is one variation of the Grunfeld which is hugely transpositional, and it can end up being a lot of different things if one of the two players is not acquainted with the theory well. And now Black has three approaches to this position. I would like you to consider which one you choose very carefully, because all three are very different. Firstly, let's go over the third most common move. Apart from these three moves, so castles, c5 and c6, on move 5, Black doesn't really have another good option. Let's look at c6 first. c6 is the least common move, and it goes into what I said previously, sort of Slav fianchetto positions, which can happen and can transpose and can occur from other openings, and it's the safest way for Black to play. I would say it's the least challenging, and it doesn't pose as much trouble to White as the other two moves, but it's solid, and if you are familiar with the Slav and semi-Slav structures, this might be the way for you to play. Now White, as I said, continues developing, Black castles, and now White can either develop his bishop or play the move h3, which will safeguard his bishop in case of any knight h5 or perhaps bishop h4 stopping the spin. So bishop e2 is one move, after which Black should play dc4. This is the common trick to force White to waste the tempo. When the f1 bishop is developed in queenside, in queen's pawn openings where there's a tension between c4 and d5, Black is best advised to wait for this move bishop e2 or bishop e3 and only then capture, because then it's virtually a tempo on the bishop, because bishop has now wasted the move to develop to e2 and then one more to develop to recapture on c4. knight bd7 castles. This is one way for white to play, and you can see that neither side has any apparent problems. In my opinion, these setups with c6, b7, a7 are much more comfortable for black when the bishop is on e7, the pawn on e6, and the g6 pawn is still on g7. So we have a sort of Caro-Kann structure, but this is perfectly playable as well. And this is similar to many hyper-modern openings, such as the Pirc, the Modern, or the King's Indian. And in fact, a setup like this can occur from any of the three mentioned openings. After castles, though, the main move for white is h3, stopping knight h5, knight g4, and bishop g4, knight bd7. Now white captures cd5, knight d5, you want to trade the c3 knight, knight d5, cd5, bishop d3. And you can see that it's a slow game. Both sides first have to develop. White still has to castle. Queen a5 check is a probing move. Knight d2 blocking the check isn't that good. The best move for white is to actually go to an endgame. So after queen d2, queen takes d2, king takes d2, we now have a sort of almost endgame and a very peaceful position, which is unfortunately for the attacking player with white highly likely to end in a draw. So with the black pieces, if you want a calm maneuvering game, which I suppose you don't if you play the Grunfeld, when you face the Brinckmann attack after bishop g7, e3, if you are playing a much higher rated opponent or a much lower rated opponent and you want to suffocate him with positional play, I would recommend the move c6. That's definitely the slowest, the safest move, and if you want to risk the least, the best move. Okay. Now let's look at the two other moves, which are way more complex and way more aggressive. Firstly, the second sideline, second most popular move, c5. This is what I would recommend for players with black. c5 is a very aggressive move. It tries to break open white's strong center. As you may remember from the introductory video, the whole point of the Grunfeld is to break white's center on the d4 point. So knight c6, sometimes queen b6, queen a5, bishop g4 stopping the knight from defending d4, and all of the pressure should be on the d4 pawn. Now, in most positions, in the queen's pawn openings, let's say this position occurs, there is a possibility for black to have an isolated queen's pawn and for white to have an isolated queen's pawn. So after c5, since the e pawn is still here, that's not that likely to happen. So white should react with the move dc5. And after queen a5, going for the recapture of the pawn, white should continue with the move rook c1. Now dc4, black captures the pawn, bishop takes c4. Now if you count the material, white has 7 pawns, black has 6 pawns, but in a while black is going to take back the c5 pawn. And it's not a gambit, because there is the Grunfeld Gambit, which we are going to look at in about 5 minutes, which also revolves around the pawn sacrifice for black. So after bishop takes c4, you can now see that black still has to develop his queenside. It's underdeveloped. White still has to develop his knight and castle his king. So this move is kind of provocative because it allows white to gain lead in development. That's not something that happens very often in the Grunfeld. And usually black is going to be the first one to castle. Okay, castles for black, knight f3 for white, and now queen takes c5. After queen takes c5, the bishop is threatened. You can already see this X-ray on the queen, which can be uncomfortable. So bishop b3, and now black doesn't have to move the queen away immediately, even though that's possible. A move such as queen a5, black plays knight c6, white castles, and now queen a5. And c5 is a more aggressive move than c6, but it results in middle games and end games with a symmetrical pawn structure. By the way, I'm outside again and the crickets just became really loud, so sorry about that if you mind the sounds of the nature. Okay, queen a5, and now you can see the main feature of the position. The only imbalance is the fact that black has the g7 pawn on g6 and white has the e2 pawn on e6. If the situation was reversed, move this pawn back, move this pawn forward, the situation is identical. Even so, there is a 4-to-2 pawn structure on the king side, a 2-to-2 pawn structure on the queen side, which means that it's highly unlikely for either side to create a passed pawn. That means that any piece trades are going to make a peaceful result or a draw highly likely. So if you trade off the pieces, this ending 4-to-4, 2-to-2 is impossible to win. You can be the best player in the world, you cannot create a passed pawn here. There's no way. So if you are looking for the most aggressive way to play against the Brinckmann attack, c5, if played correctly by white and by black, could lead to a symmetrical pawn structure, which means that a win is not too probable. Let me continue the variation. One good news about this line with c5 is that it can become very aggressive if both players know a lot of theory. So let me show you the forcing lines. And this has all been played more than 400 times. So this is high-level theory, and it goes for more than 25 moves. So if you want to get a more advanced look into the c5 line of the Brinckmann, keep watching. If not, rewind a bit and look at the last move. Okay, h3. White continues with h3. Now we have bishop f5, developing the bishop to the most active square and stopping the move e4 in many variations. Queen e2, reinforcing e4. Knight e4, stopping e4. And now it's inadvisable to trade on e4 because this bishop would be really strong. A much better move is knight d5. After knight d5, things now get tricky. If you don't know this position with black, you might misplay it, and white is going to have a simple advantage, because if you look at it now, the only weakness in black's position is the b2 square. In white's position is the b2 square or the b2 pawn, which the bishop is staring at, but the e2 queen is defending it. But I would say that these white pieces have a lot more prospects of creating trouble on the board than the black pieces. And the move knight d5 has a very clear idea in mind. In some variations, as we are going to see, white is going to sacrifice a rook on c6 for a huge initiative and a couple of pawns. Okay, we're going to look at that. So now, the only correct move for white, by far the best move, is e5. You want to chase the white pieces away as much as possible, as far away as possible, and you want to keep control of the center as much as possible. Now, you could argue that this pawn is overextended, and it is, but this bishop was too strong. Now, white has two ways to react. The most sensible way and the easiest way, and if you don't know it with white, the way that you are most probably going to choose, is bishop h2. Simply retreating the bishop back. Bishop e6, now attacking the knight twice. Rook f to d1 defending, rook f to d8 attacking the knight for the first time. And now you can see that this move e5, by chasing the bishop away, gaining a tempo and vacating the e6 square for the bishop, has created a lot of tension in the center, and black is now all of a sudden equally active. Queen c4 is the move here, defending the knight for one last time, but black has another piece coming into the attack, knight f6. Now if you count the attackers 1, 2, 3, 4, defenders 1, 2, 3, white needs to do something to defend, so e4 defending the knight. Now, rook a to c8, bringing his last piece into play, and this is why, if both players know the theory in c5 Brinckmann attacks, this is going to be extremely interesting. And despite the fact that the pawn structure is symmetrical, there is so much piece tension in this position that it's very likely somebody is going to go wrong. This is extremely tactical. Now, the best move for white, knight g5, attacking the bishop, trying to remove the most aggressive piece black has. And the move here, believe it or not, is knight d4. You don't retreat the bishop, you play knight d4, since now the knight is no longer on f3, and you have basically removed one defender, you have activated your knight, and you're also threatening if the queen moves to win the exchange, and finally, you are attacking the queen. So this is a nasty discovered attack, which white needs to react to. And now, once again, if you are unfamiliar with the position with white, this is going to be hard to figure out. You are going to play a very tactical move here, knight e7 check. Well, you might think, I'm going to take on c8 and simply win the exchange. That's not the point. After, and this is good for black, by the way, the position is equal. Black didn't blunder. Knight e7 is theory. Black plays king f8. And now, white doesn't take on c8. That would in fact be a mistake, because bishop takes queen, of course. Instead of that, white takes on e6, knight takes e6 check. And now black still doesn't have time to take the queen. And the main reaction here, the best move here, isn't to recapture the knight with the pawn, because in that case knight takes c8 and white is winning. You take on e7, king takes e7. And now knight takes d8 is one move, and the only move. Retreating the queen is losing. You are going to give your queen away for two rooks. So knight takes d8, rook takes c4, bishop takes c4, and in this position, taking the knight, which is of course loose and undefended, is a blunder, and white would win the game. If you take the knight, it doesn't matter with the king or with the queen. Take the knight, bishop takes e5, and you're going to lose. You're going to lose your knight back, and your knight is pinned to your queen or your king. So after bishop takes c4, you take knight takes e4, defending the e5 pawn, and now the position is considered to be equal. Each side has 3 minor pieces. Black has 2 knights and a bishop, white has 2 bishops and a knight. White has 2 rooks, black has a queen, white has 5 pawns, black has 6 pawns. Who is better? Well, I would prefer to have black here, to be honest. Of course, the knight isn't loose now. The position can continue here in only one way, and that's knight takes a7. You need to save your knight. Now it's still a bit tricky to save the position, but it's going to be fine because e5 is sort of loose, and you can survive this. So it's fairly tricky. Now it's equal material, and 2 bishops versus 2 knights in an open position. Well, let me tell you that in high-level games, 100% of the games from this position have ended in a draw, but on our level, or level up to 2000, 21, 2200, anything can happen here. The point is, this is 25 moves of theory. So after bishop f4, the Brinckmann attack, bishop g7, e3, if you play c5 with black, prepare to have the final position that we just looked at after knight takes f7. This is theory that you have to know if you don't want to be worse. Now, let's look at the other option. We're looking at the position after bishop f5, queen e2, knight e4, knight d5, e5, chasing the bishop away. Now, white doesn't have to chase the bishop away. There's another option, as I said, of sacking the rook, sacking the exchange. So, you take on c6, and the point is, after bc6, you now have knight e7 check, king moves, knight takes c6, tempo on the queen, queen b6, knight c takes e5. If you count the material now, black has 4 pawns, white has 6 pawns, so white gave up the exchange for a minor piece and 2 pawns. Black has the bishop pair and the knight, white has 2 knights, 2 bishops, and the material is completely equal. Who is better here? Well, it depends on individual play. You already now have pressure on f7, so you sort of have to defend with bishop e6, bishop e6, queen e6, queen c2, f5. It's an aggressive, imbalanced position, so if you want to be a bit more ambitious with white, I would suggest that you go for this rook sacrifice. So remember that after e3, if you are prepared for tons of theory and an aggressive game against a stronger opponent, be prepared for a lot of theory, and for the positions with bishop h2 on move 15 or rook takes c6 on move 15. And if you are playing somebody inexperienced against the Grunfeld, you can expect him that after c5 he's not going to know that much theory, in which case this pawn structure, before e5, with 4 against 4 and 2 against 2 is going to lead to an equal position, so you better be prepared to spice things up. Okay, and finally the most popular move, and what is considered to be the main line against the Brinckmann attack, is castles. And castles is a pawn sacrifice called the Grünfeld Gambit. Now, there are 2 options here for white. One sideline is cd5 immediately, knight d5, queen d5, bishop c7, in which case it's going to be, once again, a fairly symmetrical pawn structure. After knight a6, bishop a6, queen g2, queen f3, knight f3, ba6, rook c1. Once again, equal material. Black has doubled pawns on a7 and a6, and I would say that white is slightly better because of his pawn structure, but it's nothing major. Once again, most games end in a draw. So this is really not an ambitious way for white to play after castles. I would recommend the most active move, going for the Grunfeld Gambit, or provoking black into the Grunfeld Gambit, rook c1. Simply a much more active developing move, not resolving the tension in the center just yet. And now the gambit is c5, attacking the d4 pawn, which is unprotected, and allowing dc5. For the moment, white is a pawn up, and in some positions black is going to retake the pawn, in some positions white is going to remain a pawn up, hence the name of the opening. Now here black can either go for queen a5 immediately, after which cd5, knight e4, knight e2, knight a6, queen a4 is played. White forces a trade of queens and remains a pawn up. So this is a move I wouldn't recommend. You basically have to trade the queens here. Queen a4, knight b4. You're going to recapture one of the pawns, but in my opinion white is going to be better. knight takes, bishop takes, rook takes, knight d5. If you look at the material here, white has 7 pawns, black has 6 pawns. I would say that this is a clear pawn up for white and that white should be much better. So instead of that, after dc5, I would recommend the best move, bishop e6. This is the main move. So still for the moment, white is a pawn up. White has 8 pawns, black has 7. Knight f3 developing for white, knight c6 developing, bishop e2, knight e4, a very aggressive move. Now looking at the c5 pawn, trying to recapture and most often trying to take on c3, trying to triple white's pawns and weaken his queenside even further. Castles, knight c3, bc3, and now dc4, taking the pawn back. Count the material now, black has 7 pawns. White has 7 pawns, so black has regained his pawn, but it's going to be really hard to keep that pawn, because now white has the move knight g5, and you don't want to give up your bishop and double up your pawns. You cannot play the bishop to d5, that would be too loose in this position. Perhaps even the immediate e4 would be playable. So bishop d7, and now after bishop takes c4, you can see the point of the Grunfeld Gambit. Black has given up a pawn, black has 6 pawns, but a much healthier pawn structure and 3 actual targets in the position. The weakest point in white's position is the c3 pawn, c5 is also loose, a2 is also loose. A move like queen a5, attacking all 3 targets, can in some cases be enough to regain the pawn, but black will first want to finish his development and activate his pieces. Knight a5, exploiting, as we saw in the introductory video, the weak c4 square, which can no longer be defended by the pawn. Bishop d5, rook c8, queen d3 is the best move here, e6, chasing the bishop back, bishop f3, and now e5. Once again, black is going to try to activate his position, chase the white pieces back, and then try to target one of these 3 pawns. So this is the Grunfeld Gambit. I don't know if the name is correct to describe the opening, because almost always black is going to be regaining his pawn. This is a highly theoretical variation as well. Still, there are some games from this position, and it can branch out much sooner. And I would say that this is the best way to fight the Brinckmann. Okay, to conclude, after bishop f4, the Brinckmann attack, you can suppose that white is trying to avoid the main lines of the Grunfeld and the most aggressive lines of the Grunfeld. White either wants a game in which you are going to be out of your prep, or he wants a game with less attacking chances for black. So remember, bishop g7 is your move, white is going to play e3, and now play c6 if you want a calm maneuvering game, play c5 if you are prepared to play tons of theory and an aggressive game if you know the theory, a symmetrical pawn structure if you don't know the theory, which won't give too much chances, and after e3 play castles, the Grunfeld Gambit if you want to play the best move. I think this is the best move. You are going to be able to recapture your pawn and have a nice game. So all in all, I don't think the Brinckmann attack is challenging for black. When I played the Grunfeld, was really happy to see this. I never faced it in a tournament game, but online I faced it a lot. And I like playing against it. It's just simple to play. Whichever way you choose to play, it's not as challenging as the exchange variation, or let alone the Russian, which is the most complicated of all. We are going to cover that in the next video. Thanks very much for watching. Let me know what you think about the Brinckmann attack. Any questions you have, I'm going to try to answer in the comments. If you would like to have a more in-depth look and some tasks related to the opening, visit the Patreon page. The link is in the description below. Thanks very much. Stay tuned for more chess, and bye-bye.